We all know that managing and protecting the particular values and outstanding opportunities for experiences in national parks and other protected areas is very difficult in this era of turbulence and uncertainty. As scholars and managers, we are continuing to struggle with protection and management and in developing innovative new ideas. And today we're going to talk a little bit about a way out of this, a heuristic framework for reflecting on these protected areas and how we provide stewardship for them. Now, a heuristic framework is a framework that makes or attempts to make sense for what is happening. So let's just review the current situation. The current situation is one of growing and diversifying demands. And just look at what is expected of a protected area. We are expected to provide protection for the scenery. We are expected to provide habitat for endangered species. We are expected that protected areas serve as cauldrons of evolution. We have demands on us that protected areas serve as engines of economic development, models of democratic governance, and providing ecosystem services. And last but not necessarily least, we are expected to alleviate poverty that occurs in nearby communities or even communities located within. Protected areas have become the cornerstone of conservation. For terrestrial settings, we have about 200,000, more than 200,000 protected areas. We are expected to protect about 17% of the terrestrial surface. That's our goal in the HE targets, incidentally. And most of these protected areas are in IUCN Category 6, which deals with providing multiple uses on the same piece of land. At least that's many of the expectations. And this is the most difficult IUCN category to manage. We are also faced with financing challenges. Who should pay for protected areas? Why them? Should it be visitors? Should it be all taxpayers? Should it be something else? Should it be carbon credits? Should it be with ecosystem services? We are faced with these financial challenges. And then we have problems with our stewardship capacity. What skills does it take to provide protection? And capacity is not necessarily performance. That is, we can build capacity, but there's something else to putting together performance. And that's not necessarily just capacity. It may also deal with our organizational setting. So the question comes up is, how do we provide good stewardship in an era of change, uncertainty, conflict, and complexity? Wow, look at what's happening to our protected area. So what questions does this presentation address? Well, first of all, we're going to talk about forest fires and elephants and what they have in common. That may be kind of an interesting question for you. Then we're going to talk about how an iceberg can help us escape what's called the plus world, only to plunge into what's called the dice world. And finally, we're going to talk about how do we practice stewardship on the other side of. Now, why is it that we want to address these questions? Well, we need to build understanding in order to simplify the complexity that we have so we can make a plan and implement it. Just a very simple phrase, but that's what we have to do to address the. Now, what do forest fires and elephants have in common? Well, let's first of all take a look at fire in western North American forests. Fire is part of the scene for wildlands in western North America. It has been since who knows when, and even though this region is occupied by millions of people, fire in these forests is still a reality and something that we have to deal with um, almost every day, at least in the summer. So let's take a little bit, look at a little bit of history. Um, in 1973, there was a fire in the Fitz Creek drainage of what's called the Selway Bitterroot River, and excuse me, in the Selway drainage of the Selway Bitterroot National Forest. Sorry about that. And for the first time in a long time, since about 1910, this was no one jumped on the forest, no one went to put it out, no one organized a suppression team. And why was that? What happened here? It just simply was not suppressed. No attempt was made to suppress it, even though it was actually monitored. So in 1910, and again, this is in Western North America, there was a very large fire called the Great Burn. It burnt millions of acres. And the Forest Service, who managed this land, realized that these fires were a threat to people and to wildlife. That was their basic proposition. And that the fires had to be put out as soon as possible. And so they implemented what is called the 10 a.m. policy. That is, a fire had to be suppressed. That was the goal, to suppress this fire by 10 a.m. of the following day in which it was discovered. And that was quite a goal. And the idea was to put that fire out quickly before it became too large to control and became another 1910 burn, which incidentally killed 85 people. This 10 a.m. policy was very successfully implemented. About 98% of all the fires that were found were suppressed by 10 a.m. the next day. And it was, so that is a measure of success. But why did we change the policy? Why did the Fitz Creek fire be allowed to burn without someone trying to? Well, we found that in the 1970s that fire was actually a natural process in these Western North American ecosystems, many of them. Now, fire had different kinds of patterns dependent upon the specific kind of ecosystem, but it was a natural process. And at the same time, in the 1970s, we found that because of fire suppression, there was increased fuel accumulation. And this increased fuel accumulation led to, in particularly in drought years, fires that were very, very intense. And so what we recognize, and by the way, excuse me, again, I'll go back. These fires were so intense that they were very difficult to suppress. Fires got larger, which is just the opposite effect of what was intended, which was to keep a fire smaller. And what we recognized, that the ecosystem that in which we live is in a state of constant change. It's not static. And this adaptive cycle here that you see kind of represents this notion of a constant state of change. And so suppressing fire became very, very difficult and needed a change in policy, which led to the Fitz Creek fire not being suppressed. Now, elephants in Kruger National Park. This is pretty interesting. What's this got to do with anything? Well, in the late 19th century, Kruger National Park was established, as you can see over here. It's in South Africa, located in eastern South Africa, immediately adjacent to the Mozambique country of Mozambique. And in the 1920s and 1930s, the park was fenced to basically keep the wildlife within the park, and not so it went out of the park and raided on farmers and their crops. In the 1930s on, a number of dams and water holes were created to provide water for the wildlife in times of drought. So here's a picture of elephants that occur in the park, and these water holes led to increased herbivore populations, in particular uh, elephants, which, as we all know, require huge amounts of, vegetation on which to live each day. So not only did other herbivores increase, like impalas and so on, but elephants increased in population. And this increase in population and the devastation of the vegetation decreased the resilience of the system to adapt to changes, in particular drought. Even though there were more water holes, the population of animals had increased, which meant the demand for water was increased, and this all decreased the resilience of the system to deal with drought. And so that led to culling of the elephants. Basically, elephants and elephant families were removed by a shotgun or elephant gun or something like that. And this culling of animals led to greater social conflict. So in Kruger National Park, the culling of elephants became so controversial, so complex, so uncertain that animal rights groups entered the fray. International animal rights groups entered the fray and pressured the South African government to stop the culling of elephants. And of course, when they stopped the culling of elephants, guess what? The elephant population increased even faster. And this increased pressure and social conflict led to the recognition that managing elephant populations is more a matter of social aptitude than technical competency. This was the recognition that came to the scientists in Kruger National Park. This is a social conflict, not necessarily a situation. So what's in common between these two case studies? Well, one thing that is in common is that both case studies are reacting to specific events. One deals with fire events, the other deals with animal events and animal needs for water. They've focused on only parts of a system. In the case of fires, they focused on fire as a disturbance, not as a natural part of the system. In case of elephants, they only focused on water. The interventions in both cases had unintended consequences. In the one case, it was fuel accumulations and greater fires with greater intensity. And in the other case, it was increased social conflict. And here we have conflict, okay, over this. And so this led eventually, in both cases, a need to dive deeper to understand what in the heck is going on. The actions we were taking were having exactly the opposite of what we had intended. And so we needed to dive. So what else is in common from one area to another? So the thing that's in common is that we recognized that we are actually involved in a social ecological system that is a coupled system that had social parts as well as ecological parts. And there is little understanding of this social ecological system, of its dimensions, biophysically or socially. And they were using models based on flawed assumptions about the world. And I'm not talking about models at the superficial level. I'm talking about models. So let's go to the next question is, how does an iceberg help us escape the plus world only to plunge into the dice world? And this iceberg that we see here is the model that helped us better understand what is happening. And we all know that the most dangerous part of an iceberg is the part below the surface, the part we cannot see. What we usually see when we deal with these issues such as elephants and forest fires is just the tip of the iceberg, the part that we can see. But we have to dive deeper to figure out what is going on. And so in this case, we can see that the tip of the iceberg are events, that is, the individual fires or elephant population, but underlying that are certain patterns of behavior. Underlying those patterns of behavior is a systemic structure of the social ecological system, and underlying that is a mental model about how we view the world. In one case, it's the plus world, and in another case, it's the dice one. And this, as you see on the right side of the illustration, the deeper we dive, the more leverage we have to effectuate change. That if we stay focused on just events, we may not be able to make much change, but if we dive deeper and think about the mental model, we can change the world. Our assumptions upon which mental model of the world are built are changing. Okay, so we all have mental models of how the world operates, and our assumptions of those mental models are actually changing or need to be changed. So one mental model assumes the world to be predictable. That is, A will always cause B, or will cause B with a certain frequency. That the relationships are linear. That means it's kind of a straight line. That the world is understandable. If we have enough money, we just do enough research, we will be able to understand what's going on. And the world is stable. That is, it doesn't change. It's a very stable kind of situation. And this is what we call the plus world. Plus. Just remember that. Plus stands for predictable, linear, understandable, stable. And so what does that mean? And where have we changed to? A newer set of assumptions is that the world is dynamic. That is, the relationships between two variables are nonlinear, that a little bit of change will result in a large amount of change in a dependent variable, that it is impossible to completely understand. That means we probably will never have enough money to understand it, to gather the data that we think we need. It is that it is complex, and what we mean here is that when parts are put together, when they're integrated, they produce some properties that we cannot predict from their individual components, and that the world is ever changing. It is not stable or static. And some people kind of. And that the challenge thus are wicked and messy. That when we live in a dice world, we recognize that the messiness. It doesn't mean that we're living in a different world. The plus world assumptions don't work anymore. The dice world assumptions are much more accurate as to the character of the kind of environments in which we operate. And the challenges that we have are called wicked and messy. And those are technical terms, not emotional or valued terms. They're technical terms about the character of the problems. And they're messy or wicked because there's confusion, conflict, or uncertainty over the goals of our protected areas. In some cases, we don't have very well stated goals. In other cases, we have very well stated goals and we have conflict. And still in other cases, there's simply uncertainty about what we mean. And there's also lack of agreement on cause-effect relationships. And that's because we don't do research on a lot of the things that are really important to us in terms of managing protected areas. So scientists are not necessarily in agreement that if we do something, that some other thing will result from that. So we've got these two things combined, and they combine produce what are called wicked problems. And here's some characteristics, and you can probably think of these as we talk about them. Wicked problems have no definitive formulation. There's no agreement about what the what the what the wicked problem is. There's no measure of success. Solutions are more or less useful, not right or wrong. There's no template to follow if we're dealing with wicked problems. Nothing to tell us what to do next. There may be more than one explanation of a wicked problem. One wicked problem is a symptom of another wicked problem. So these things are all connected. There is no definitive scientific test as to whether we've come to the right solution. Solutions are simply one shot. What that means is, this solution works well over here, but may not work well in another place. Solutions are unique, and the designers of these solutions are responsible for their actions. Now just think about this for a moment. No definitive formulation, no measure of success. Solutions are more or less useful, more than one explanation. And what this means is that we have a difficult job to do, and these wicked problems are part of the cause of the difficulties that we have. Now, you may be able to think of some wicked problems. Poverty solution, for example, is a wicked problem. There is no definitive formulation of what it means to be living in poverty. There's simply no measure of success. What works in one situation may work in another. Higher education is another example. And one lack of higher education may be a symptom of people who live in poverty. There's no definitive scientific test. A wicked problem can only be defined and understood once you try to solve it. And Riddle and Weppert are two famous people in systems thinking that where a lot of this theory comes out of. So, we can only understand it once we try to solve it. We have to apply solutions to a problem to see if they work, and if they do seem to work, if they are more or less useful, we've got a better understanding of the character. Now these problems are complex, and Lawrence Peter here says some problems are so complex that you have to be highly intelligent and well informed just to be undecided about them. That means what's probably happening in many cases is that we are simplifying so greatly that we don't really understand them. We don't really understand where we are with respect to wicked problems. Now, here's what the challenge is for us. Conventional approaches to planning assumes that problems are tame. And by tame, I mean situations where we do have agreement in society on the goals, and we do have agreement about cause-effect relationships. And conventional approaches to planning assume that these problems are tame when we have those conditions. But the problems that we are faced with are wicked and sometimes even worse, messy. And thus, as Aaron Wildowski has said, a famous planner from the 1970s, planning fails wherever it's attempted. And the reason it fails is because approaches to planning for wicked problems have come from conventional approaches that work with tame problems. So why does planning fail? Well, we can say reasons such as time, money, resources, and so on. Those are the common kinds of things. And that kind of reflection, that kind of statement reflects thinking at the tip of the iceberg, the part of the iceberg that we can actually see. So yes, those are reasons for planning to fail, but they're not the real reasons. And these derive from conventional approaches to planning. So what are some barriers? You look at these barriers to planning, and this comes from a book as well as some of this thinking that John Cole, a colleague from Costa Rica, and I put together called The Future Has Other Plans. These barriers are such as low stakeholder involvement due to premium on expert knowledge, And minimizing subjective variables means low power sharing, and thus low feeling of stakeholder ownership. The bureaucratic nature results in low trust, transparency, or a sense of fairness. Okay, that's a barrier to planning. Emphasis on objective, quantifiable, technical problem-solving methodologies, not on building relationships with community members or problems. Okay, plus thinking, that is the plus world thinking, oversimplifies problems and assumes that plans do not need to be updated with a reasonable frequency. Many of our protected area agencies have plans with 10 to 15-year horizons, and often they need to be updated much faster than that, much sooner, with a much greater frequency than that. Management agencies do not invest in staff capacities or skills. Rather, they dedicate resources to consultant experts. When consultants leave, staff does not have the capacity to plan, facilitate, deeply discuss issues, or implement their own plans. This is one of the major barriers that we have, particularly in the developing world. High staff rotation between protected areas. Incentives for short-term thinking. Technical staff stays in central office with best salaries. Lack of qualified staff, underfunded, and so on. This all makes implementing a plan in a dice world very difficult, and yet our planning processes fail to write these plans. So here's a nice little thing here. Good solution, Bob. Now all we need is a good problem. And so what this means is that we have developed tools that are planning tools that are not appropriate for the kind of wicked problems. They're appropriate for tame problems, which is fine. Excuse me, which is fine, but solving wicked problems requires processes that are inherently different. Processes for addressing wicked problems are not well developed and may never be, because each solution is unique. Think about this. This means we have to have some kind of process ourselves as planners for identifying whether a problem is wicked or tame, and we have to have some kind of framework for thinking through the wicked problems. So, successful planning, what does that require? Well, in the plus world, it requires just applying the best available technical expertise. That's what we've assumed in conventional planning, the planning that most of us have engaged in, most of us were taught in the real. But in the dice world, successful planning depends on a couple of different things. It depends upon technical expertise, which we admit when we talk about planning for wicked problems in a dice world. We're not saying get rid of what we know, what we've done best in the past, but it requires something else. And that something else is public engagement to build consensus, to enhance learning, and build ownership of. So here's a little other way of looking at this. Successful planning requires technical expertise, requires us to build consensus, it requires us to emphasize learning because of the uncertainty in the plus world, and we also have to develop institutions that can enhance the use of all these three. So we need a model of the wicked world, of the dice world. And this has to be based on different assumptions, and it has to be based on focusing on reflection and understanding more than prediction. Okay, we need to understand these systems. So now how do we practice stewardship on the other side of complexity? So if we assume we are in the plus world, we are simplifying. We always have to simplify because these are complex systems. But if we want to get to simplicity in the dice world, we have to understand the complexity of these systems. So how do we practice stewardship on this other side of complexity. We need to change. So here's a mental model of what a protected area manager really does, and this is debatable to some of you. One is that we have to manage the competing demands. I talked about those demands earlier as to what society expects from a protected area. We have to manage relationships, and those relationships are with our constituencies, which some people call stakeholders. And we have to manage our learning. That is, we are all always in a need to learn because of the uncertainty and change that characterizes our world, whether we want to admit it or not. And all of these interact. For example, our constituencies express the demands that we have to deal with. And so we have to manage our relationships to get a better idea and to build things like trust and ownership in order to manage demands. But we also cannot forget to manage learning. The learning is needed for us to put together these demands that are always on us, and then to work with our constituencies to help them understand what these different demands and their consequences are. So what is our plan for dealing with this? Or some of you may ask, well, so what? That doesn't involve me. Well, it always involves you. As an academic, as a student, as an NGO, we need to think of the system holistically. We need to start with the whole. We need to link thinking and doing. Focus on planning, not the physical document, the plan. The planning is what is most important here. Planning done holistically, planning done at the system level, planning done with linking thinking and doing. What that means is that we're not separating planning. And as Dwight Eisenhower once mentioned, one of the presidents of the United States and outstanding military leader in World War II, he said one time that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So what do we do? What do we do in this situation? So first of all, we need to plan holistically. And holistic planning is a facilitated, continuous dialogue with constituencies designed to construct a consensus about a desired future. Okay, this is a dialogue. That's what we're looking at this as, a dialogue. And it's a continuous dialogue. Holistic planning focuses on process. How do we go about planning determines its success. And we can say that from the very moment a planning process starts, we can determine whether it's going to be successful or not by what's happening. Planning is guided more by principles than procedures. So here's some principles to guide planning in a wicked and messy world. And these come from the notion of holistic planning. Well, first principle is to ensure our constituencies are ready and aligned for planning. That means if we're working with people all the time, they have to have the capacity to work with us. They have to have the capacity to understand the technical procedures and the process by which we are going to go through this planning process. So we have to work with them to develop. We have to create balanced relationships of power and heartfelt needs. We can't treat people differently. We need to have access to all the information. Everyone needs to have access to the information that is needed. We need to build consensus. And a consensus means that it's kind of a grudging agreement. It does not mean unanimous agreement, because that's impossible. But how far along can we get enough people to agree that it becomes a tipping point and that we can move forward? And consensus is needed in these contentious and changing environments to move forward, to implement. We have to integrate multiple forms of knowledge. Some forms of knowledge are data. We are all familiar with that as managers and planners. Other forms of knowledge are experiential or even spiritual. We have to figure out a way to integrate these different forms. We have to design our planning to address these technical problems while building social capital. So by building social capital, we mean an ability of both our experts as well as our constituencies to move together, to enhance their ability to work together. Okay, so that's part of designing planning, is to build this social capital. In our situations, we have to facilitate development. That's building their capital of others, but don't do their work for them. So this is kind of a reflection of the old adage that rather than giving a person a fish, we teach them how to fish. That's the way we need to move forward in this wicked and messy world. And when it comes to hiring consultants, for example, the consultants shouldn't do the work for people who have the capability of doing it for themselves. The consultants have an important role of facilitating the. We need to build holistic planning teams, teams that think in various different dimensions, teams that buy into these principles so that we can move forward with each member of the team bringing a different skill, bringing a different kind of passion into the planning process. We have to plan and implement continuously. So planning is not an event. It's a continuing process that feeds into management, that feeds into implementation. And then we learn from that implementation and we replan to learn from our prediction. We must carry out every planning moment holistically. That is, we're thinking about what's happening in terms of our competencies, in terms of our value systems, in terms of our shared values, and in terms of our institutions. How do we think? How do we carry out each of these planning moments that's thinking about different domains? So, successful problem solving requires finding the right solution to the right problem. And as Russell Ackoff once said, we fail more often because we solve the wrong problem than because we get the wrong solution to the right problem. That is, we fail to ask the right questions. And Russell Ackoff is, again, another internationally recognized authority on systems thinking. So think a moment about this particular quote. Are we solving the wrong problem? Okay, and I've seen this many times. And we're solving the wrong problem because we have not dived deep enough along that iceberg to get to the underlying causal. So if you're interested, you might want to look at this book, The Future Has Other. Okay, so I want to thank you for watching and listening today. It's been fun talking about these concepts, and I think if you learn to apply them, you'll be a much more effective planner. Take care.